guys, my name is Thomas, and today we're going to be taking a look at my Yarok the Desecrated Commander deck. Yarok is a 5-mana commander, 2, a black, green, and a blue for a 3/5 legendary elemental horror. It has Death Touch, Lifelink, and if a permanent entering the battlefield would cause an ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. This means that any enter the battlefield abilities will trigger an additional time when you have Yarok on the battlefield. So this deck is filled with a bunch of cards that have ETB abilities and payoffs for ETBs that will net us double the value due to our commander being on the battlefield. Starting out with the lands, I have 37 in this deck, which is a higher amount for my decks than I typically do. I have a fair amount of landfall synergy in here, so the higher number of lands helps me benefit from the landfall more often. I have all 3 on-color fetch lands, all 3 on-color shock lands, and check lands. One particularly important point about the fetch lands being very strong in this deck because you can play a fetch land down and tap it, pay 1 life, and sacrifice it, and then search for another land, and in doing so you will have 2 landfall triggers, which will then be doubled, so you'll have 4 landfall triggers technically if you have Yarok on the battlefield. I have City of Brass and Mana Confluence, which will help with mana fixing. They can tap for 1 mana of any color if you pay 1 life. Command Tower is an auto-include in most commander decks that aren't mono-colored, obviously. Then next up I have Plaza of Heroes. Plaza of Heroes can tap for 1 colorless. It can also tap for 1 mana of any color and spend this to only cast a legendary spell. It can also tap for 1 mana of any color among legendary permanents you control. And then the kicker is you can pay 3 and tap Exile Plaza of Heroes. Target legendary creature gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So this acts as some extra protection for our commander because Yarok is going to be targeted a lot when he's on the battlefield due to his powerful ability, and it really ramps up the power level of this deck when he's in play. I have Bajuka Bog, which is going to act as some graveyard hate when it enters the battlefield, and that trigger will get doubled if Yarok's on the battlefield, so you'll get to exile 2 target players' graveyards. I have Takenuma Abandoned Mire. This land is strictly good. It can act as a basic swamp, or you can use its channel ability to pay 3 and a black and discard Takenuma, and then mill 3 cards, and then you get to return a target creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. So this is very strong. It's just extra value you have in your deck. It doesn't take up a spot in your deck for spells, and it also can't be countered traditionally unless your opponent has a card that will counter an activated ability, but it's not a spell, so traditional counter spells like Mana Drain or Counterspell will not be able to counter this ability. Next up, I have Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, and Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. These will help with fixing, with Urborg and Yavimaya, turning all your lands into swamps and forests, respectively, in addition to their other types. And then I have Reliquary Tower, which is somewhere in here. There it is. That will give us no maximum hand size, which is very important for this deck because we'll be generally drawing a lot of cards, and when you draw a lot of cards, you typically want to keep them in your hand. So this will allow us to do so. And then finally, I have a Zaggoth Triome, which will come and tap, but it taps for any of our colors. Next up, we have Ramp. I have 15 pieces of Ramp in here. This is designed to ramp us early to get Yarok onto the battlefield as soon as possible so that we can get our value engines online. starting off with the artifact ramp I have in the deck, not too much. I have Arcane Signet, Soul Ring, and Thought Vessel. We are playing green, obviously, so there's going to be a lot more creature-based ramp and land-based ramp than artifact ramp. In terms of creature-based ramp, we have Arbor Elf, Azusa Lost But Seeking, which will allow us to put multiple lands onto the battlefield each turn, Birds of Paradise, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and Springbloom Druid, which will enter the battlefield and have a sacrifice a land to search up 2. With Yarok on the battlefield, we will be able to sacrifice 2 lands to search up 4 and get 4 landfall triggers that will then be doubled with Yarok as well. Next up, the land-based ramp, we have Burgeoning, Cultivate, Exploration, Farseek, and Rampant Growth. These will either tutor up lands to put on the battlefield directly, or in the case of Burgeoning and Exploration, will allow us to put multiple lands on the battlefield either on our turn or a land on the battlefield on your opponent's turn if they play a land themselves with Burgeoning. And finally, the last one is Jeweled Lotus here. This is a very powerful card. For 0 mana, you can play it and tap and sacrifice it to add 3 mana of any one color to cast your commander. This is very strong in this deck. It's a 5 CMC commander. You can have 2 lands out and play this card and then get your commander out on turn 2. It's also very good in late game if your commander has been removed a few times. This will help you mitigate that commander tax and get it back on the battlefield. Moving on from there, we're going to talk about the removal and interaction that I have in this deck. There are 14 pieces of removal or interaction. I'm including protection spells, counter spells, targeted removal, and board wipes in this category. Starting off with targeted removal, I have Assassin's Trophy, Beast Within, Deadly Rollick, Putrefy. Next up for counterspells, I have traditional counterspell. I have Fierce Guardianship, which is a very strong card. You can play it for free if you control your commander. Force of Will, another free counterspell, very powerful. Mana Drain, and Swan Song. This is generally considered a lot of counterspells for a casual deck. When I was making this deck, I wanted it to be quite strong so it could compete against some higher powered decks at higher powered tables, and having more interaction at instant speed is a really good way to do that. So that's the route I took there. In terms of board wipes, I have Cyclonic Rift, Damnation, and Toxic Deluge. And finally, I have 2 pieces of protection in here. The first of which is Heroic Intervention. It's an instant for 1 in the green. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. It's a classic in green. Very good to have in decks that you want to protect your board. And then finally, I have Sylvan Safekeeper. This is a creature-based protection spell. For 1 green mana, it's a 1/1. I can sacrifice a land, and target creature I control gains Shroud until end of turn. This is very strong in here because we're going to have a lot of lands with having multiple land drops per turn and tutoring for lands. So we're going to have extra lands to be able to sacrifice, and in response to someone targeting one of our creatures, we can sacrifice a land and give that creature Shroud so it cannot be targeted. Moving on from there, we're going to talk about card draw. I have 14 pieces of card draw in here. This is a good amount. It's aimed at really gaining a lot of card advantage on our opponents and making it difficult for them to keep up with us. There are 5 enchantment-based card draw engines in here. First of which being Elemental Bond, then Guardian Project, then Sylvan Library, which is not really an engine, but it'll give you some extra card advantage and selection at the beginning of the turn. Very good in early game. Then next up I have the Great Henge, which is very strong. You can play it for a reduced mana cost, and you can tap it for 2 green and gain 2 life. And whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can put a 1/1 counter on it and draw a card, and that ability will be doubled with Yarok on the battlefield. And then finally I have Tribute to the World Tree, which does a similar thing. This one, when you have the trigger doubled, if you have a creature with lower than 3 power, the first trigger will go on the stack and resolve first, and that creature will get 2 1/1 counters, and then the second trigger will resolve, and you will draw for that creature. And if the creature already has 3 power, then you'll just draw twice. There are 9 creature-based card draw pieces in the deck, starting off with AC Tyrant of Gyre Strait. This is going to act as a little bit of a ramp spell in late game, giving us an additional land drop on each of our turns, and then it will also draw us cards when we play a land, which will get doubled if Yarok's on the battlefield. So we play a land, we'll draw 2 cards. Next up we have Baleful Strix. We'll draw when it enters. Coiling Oracle. We'll flip the top. If it's a land, we'll put it onto the battlefield. If it's not, we'll draw it. Elvish Visionary. We'll draw when it enters. Icefang Coatl. Also draw when it enters. Muldrifter. You want to evoke this out for 2 and a blue, and then we'll draw 2 cards when it enters. If we have Yarok out, it'll draw us 4. Risen Reef. When it enters the battlefield, or another elemental enters the battlefield. That's key because our commander is an elemental. Look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't put that card on the battlefield, put it into your hand. After that, we have really the best card draw engine in the deck. We have Tatiova, Benthic Druid. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, you'll gain 1 life and draw a card. So when you have Yarok on the battlefield, you'll gain 2 life, draw 2 cards, and you'll be able to do this a lot every turn. If you have some other pieces on the battlefield, that will give us extra land drops. And then finally, we have Wall of Blossoms, which will draw us a card when it enters the battlefield. Now talking about enter the battlefield effects and payoffs. Obviously there's going to be a lot in this deck because that's the whole idea of the commander. There are 16 that I haven't mentioned so far. There's some standouts that I want to talk about. First of all, Crater of Behemoth. Great win con, one of the best in the game. You pay 8 mana when it enters the battlefield. Creatures you control gain trample and +X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. This ability will get doubled by Yarok, so you'll have a bunch of creatures that are massive with trample, and you swing in and win the game. Next up, I have Gruff Triplets. This is very strong to play and then have an instant board state. The enter the battlefield ability will get doubled again, and you'll have an even bigger board state if you have Yarok out. Ob Nixilis the Fallen, very strong in this deck, has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target player lose 3 life. If you do, put 3 1/1 counters on Obnexos the Fallen. So with Yarok out, this will get doubled, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you'll have target player lose 3 life twice, and you will put 3 1/1 counters on Obnexos twice. After that, we're going to move on to Palinchron, one of the best cards in the deck. It can do a lot in here. It will very easily go infinite. If you have Yarok on the battlefield, you can play it for 7, and then when it comes into play, untap up to 7 lands, and that will happen twice. So you'll have 2 triggers on the stack. You will have the first one resolve, untap 7 lands, and then you can tap those 7 lands again before the second trigger resolves, and then the second trigger will resolve, and you untap those lands. You'll have 7 floating mana, and then 7 untapped lands, and then you can keep doing that over and over again, and you'll make infinite mana. After that, we're going to talk about Rampaging Beowulfs. This is pretty simple. Has trample, 6/6, and then whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. This is just going to give you a big army of green beasts over a short amount of time when you're playing multiple lands per turn. And then finally here, we're going to talk about Sheoldred. This acts as an edict effect. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature or planeswalker. When Yarok's on the battlefield, this will get doubled, so each opponent will have to sacrifice 2. So this is essentially a 6-for-1 exchange. You'll play 1 card, and your opponents will collectively have to sacrifice 6. Some additions that I've made recently to the deck that I've found very impressive. One of them is Displacer Kitten. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So this is going to allow you to blink all your permanents with ETB effects every time you play a non-creature spell. So you play an instant or a sorcery or an artifact, you can blink a creature with a big ETB effect like an Arcana of Cruelty or a Gruff Triplets and get that effect again. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Kodama of the East Tree. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put on the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. So this is very strong in here. You have this card on the battlefield, you play a 4 CMC card of any type. You can then put a 3 CMC or lower onto the battlefield for free. It doesn't chain because it can't chain off of itself, but every time you play a permanent, you'll get another permanent on for free. This also works with lands, which is very strong in here because of the landfall triggers. So you can play a land as your land for turn, and then with this ability, because it has equal or lesser mana value, you can play another land even though you already used your land drop for turn. And you can keep doing this if you have fetch lands or additional land drops or like a rampant growth or something. So it's very strong, very good at building a huge board state very quickly. And then finally, I'm going to talk about an artifact I have in here, Sword of Hearth and Home, 3 mana for an equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from green and white. More importantly, whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target creature you own, then search your library for a basic land, put both onto the battlefield under your control, then shuffle. So this is doing 2 things for us. 1, it's blinking a creature, and we'll get that creature's ETB ability again, and also it's getting us another land, which will trigger our landfall abilities for free. The last section we're going to talk about here is going to be alternative win cons. I have 3 in here. This is going to be facilitating different ways to win other than combat damage. The first one is Invasion of Ikoria. This is just going to help make the combat damage win easier and more guaranteed. So you can pay X and 2 green, and you tutor for a creature card with X or less mana value, and then you put it onto the battlefield when this battle enters the battlefield. And because it's an ETB effect, you'll get to tutor for 2 things. Typically, I'll tutor for a Greater Behemoth and a Gruff Triplets because they'll synergize together, and then that's just pretty much an instant win. Next up, we have Scapeshift. You can sacrifice any number of lands, search your library for up to that many land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So this is designed to get a lot of landfall triggers all at once. So if you need to draw a bunch of cards and you have just Scapeshift in your hand, and like an AEC, Tyrant of Gyre straight on the battlefield, you can sacrifice, say, 5 lands, search for 5 lands, get 5 landfall triggers, draw 5 cards or 10 cards if you have Yarok out, and you have plenty of cards to play and hopefully win the game with. Or if you want to use this as a win con, if you have Nixil's the Fallen out, you can do the same and then get a bunch of landfall triggers and drain your opponent's life total and make this guy super big. Lastly, we're going to talk about Torment of Hailfire. This is a classic, pretty simple. In this deck, generally how it goes is I make infinite mana and then put infinite mana into Torment of Hailfire and then win. That's really the simplest way to put it. And yeah, those are my alternative win cons. My take on Yarok is quite strong. I'd say if you're playing in a more casual table, this strong of deck might not be for you. If you would perhaps like a version with a lower power level, you could probably take out some of the interaction pieces like the counter spells. I think that'd be a good route to make this deck less powerful and less of a situation where a lower power table will kind of feel bad when they have all their stuff countered. But overall, for me, this deck is very fun to play and has a lot of potential to do really crazy things and have a lot of crazy moments. My favorite thing personally in Magic is drawing cards, and I think that's the same for a lot of people, and this card is going to be doing a lot of that. You just have to be careful to not take 10-minute turns when you draw 30 cards and have a lot of options. That is a problem you may run into when playing this deck. Anyways guys, that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it and that it gave you some ideas on how to build a Yarok deck of your own. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment telling us what other deck techs you'd like to see. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.